My father slapped me before the meeting had even officially begun. It wasn't dramatic, no shouting, no sudden explosion of anger, just the quiet, controlled kind of slap powerful men deliver when they believe the room already belongs to them. The sound echoed sharply against the glass walls of the conference room. For a moment, no one spoke. The skyline of Manhattan stretched behind the floor-to-ceiling windows. A long walnut table ran through the center of the room, polished so perfectly the overhead lights reflected across it like a second ceiling. Around it sat the people who had watched my family run its business for decades, lawyers, advisors, and relatives who had learned long ago that silence was the safest response when my father lost his temper. Richard Hayes slowly lowered his hand. "You're being difficult again," he said quietly. Across the table, my younger brother Derek leaned back in his chair with a faint smile, like someone watching a scene he had expected to happen. No one objected. No one asked if I was all right. My name is Eleanor Hayes. I'm 38 years old, and by the time that meeting began, I had spent more than half my life believing loyalty inside a family actually meant something. That afternoon corrected that misunderstanding. Victor Lang, the family attorney, pushed a thin stack of documents toward me. His movements were calm and professional, as if the tension in the room had nothing to do with him. "Eleanor," he said, adjusting his glasses, "this transfer agreement is quite straightforward." Derek leaned forward slightly. "Just sign the penthouse over," he said. "You're barely there anyway." My Aunt Marianne folded her hands together. "Your father only wants what's fair." I glanced down at the first page. Property transfer authorization, $12 million penthouse. My father rested both palms on the table. "We're family," he said evenly. Victor slid a pen toward me. For a moment, the entire room seemed to lean forward, waiting. Instead of picking it up, I pushed the pen back across the polished wood. No. Derek's chair scraped against the floor. My father leaned closer now, the calm beginning to drain from his face. "You don't say no to this family." I met his eyes. "Then maybe," I said quietly. "This meeting isn't really about family." Victor shifted slightly, and from near the far end of the table, a voice spoke for the first time. Calm, professional, uninterested in the tension filling the room. "Mr. Hayes, before we continue, you may want to review the trust documents." My father frowned. "What trust documents?" The man stood and placed a leather folder on the table. Samuel Ortega, the trustee appointed by my grandfather's estate. He opened the folder slowly, and suddenly a single question settled over everyone in the room. Did my father actually know who owned the house he had been living in? Derek had always been very good at turning his problems into someone else's responsibility. He leaned back in his chair like a man who had already been promised something, one arm draped across the leather armrest, his posture relaxed, almost bored. The tension in the room didn't seem to bother him at all. "You're not even using the penthouse properly," he said, gesturing toward the documents. "That place has 4 bedrooms, a private terrace, and a full view of the park. It's ridiculous for one person." His tone wasn't angry. It was entitled, "You spend half your life traveling anyway." He continued, "Let me take it. I'd actually use it." I didn't answer, because Derek and I both knew the real reason this meeting existed. 3 weeks earlier, Derek had lost $700,000 in what he described as a temporary investment setback. Most people would have used a simpler word: reckless. The losses came from a string of high-risk ventures that promised fast returns and delivered something closer to financial collapse. Normally, my father covered Derek's mistakes quietly. Over the years, several of those disasters had simply disappeared after a few quiet phone calls and a few discreet transfers. But this time was different. The numbers had grown large enough that banks had started asking questions, which meant the solution had to come from somewhere else. Preferably from me. My Aunt Marianne spoke next, her voice gentle in the way people often use when they're trying to disguise pressure as concern. "Your father has done so much for you," she said. "Sometimes family requires flexibility." Derek gave a small shrug, like the outcome had already been decided. But my father wasn't smiling anymore. Richard Hayes rested both hands on the polished table and looked directly at me. "Let's be clear about something." His voice carried the quiet certainty of a man who had spent decades giving orders. "Everything this family has," he said slowly, "exists because of me." The room waited. Victor watched carefully. Derek's eyes stayed fixed on the papers in front of me. The pen still lay where Victor had placed it. For several seconds, no one moved. Then I slid the document back across the table and answered with a single word. "No." For a moment after I refused, the room stayed strangely calm, the kind of calm that exists just before something breaks. Derek reacted first. He leaned forward, elbows resting on the table, his voice carrying that familiar tone of casual judgment he had used since we were teenagers. "She's always been selfish," he said. "You know that. Dad." The comment wasn't loud, but it was perfectly placed, just enough to shift the mood in the room. My Aunt Marianne sighed softly, as if my refusal had created an unnecessary inconvenience for everyone present. Victor Lang adjusted his glasses and cleared his throat. When he spoke, his voice carried the careful neutrality of a lawyer who preferred conflict to resolve itself without his involvement. "Legally speaking," he said, folding his hands over the documents, "there doesn't appear to be any reason for Eleanor to refuse the family request." The words settled across the table. Not a command, but close enough. My father pushed his chair back. The legs scraped sharply across the floor as he stood. Richard Hayes rarely raised his voice. He didn't need to. Most people complied long before that point. "You don't say no to me," he said slowly. The calm authority in his voice had shifted now, replaced by something colder. I didn't move. I believe I just did. For a split second, the room went still. Then my father crossed the space between us in 2 quick steps. I saw his hand rise, but my mind barely had time to register what was happening. The slap cut through the room. Sharp. Sudden. My head turned slightly with the impact. Heat spread across my cheek as the room fell into a silence so complete it almost felt rehearsed. No one stood. No one intervened. Derek leaned back again, watching. Marianne stared down at the table. Victor studied a page that wasn't there. 43 years of family history had trained everyone in that room to pretend nothing unusual had just happened. My father lowered his hand slowly, breathing out as if the situation had finally been handled. Then another voice entered the silence. Calm, measured, unmoved by the tension filling the room. "Mr. Hayes." Samuel Ortega closed the leather folder in front of him and looked directly at my father. "The trust prohibits actions that expose the property to legal risk." My father frowned. Samuel's voice remained steady, and striking the beneficiary in a formal meeting, he added quietly, "Would qualify." The room shifted. Samuel held my father's gaze. "You may want to stop right now." The tension in the room changed the moment Samuel Ortega spoke. He wasn't part of the family. That alone made his voice different from everyone else's, calm, precise, and completely uninterested in the emotional theater unfolding across the table. Samuel had spent most of the meeting quietly reviewing documents inside the leather binder he had brought with him. When he finally closed it, the soft snap of the cover seemed louder than it should have been. He looked directly at my father. "Mr. Hayes," he said, "before this discussion continues, there's a matter that needs clarification." My father turned toward him, irritation already returning to his face. "This is a family matter," Richard replied. "I'm sure whatever it is can wait." Samuel didn't react. Instead, he asked a single question. Do you actually know who legally owns the mansion you live in? The room paused. Derek blinked. What kind of question is that? He said. My father leaned back slightly in his chair, a faint smile returning to his face. Of course I know who owns it, he replied. It's my house. Samuel studied him for a moment. Is it? The question lingered longer than anyone expected. Victor shifted in his seat. Marianne glanced nervously between them. My father gave a dismissive wave. I've lived there for 20 years, he said. That property belongs to me. Samuel opened the binder again. Inside were neatly organized pages, legal filings, trust documentation, notarized certifications. He turned the binder slowly toward the center of the table. Victor leaned forward immediately. Samuel slid the first document across the polished surface. According to the trust records filed 13 years ago, he said evenly, You don't. The document Samuel placed on the table didn't look dramatic, just several pages of legal text, notarized signatures, and a trust seal pressed neatly into the corner. But the moment Victor Lang leaned forward to read it, the mood in the room changed. Samuel spoke the way experienced attorneys do when they know the facts will carry more weight than their tone. 13 years ago, he said, sliding another page beside the first. Richard Hayes established an estate trust to manage several family assets. My father frowned. What does that have to do with anything Samuel didn't look up? The Manhattan property you currently occupy, the mansion valued at approximately $24 million, was placed inside that trust. Derek frowned immediately. That's ridiculous. Samuel tapped the second paragraph with one finger. The trust structure lists a single beneficiary. Victor had stopped flipping pages. His eyes were already fixed on the name printed in the center of the document. Samuel said it anyway. Eleanor Hayes. The room went still. For the first time since the meeting began, Derek's confidence faltered. Wait. What he said. Looking between Samuel and my father. Dad owns that house. Samuel shook his head slightly. That's a common misunderstanding. He turned another page. Mr. Hayes was granted what's known as a life residency right. My father's jaw tightened. In practical terms, Samuel continued, he has the legal right to live in the property. A pause. But ownership of the asset itself belongs to the trust beneficiary. He looked directly at me. Eleanor. Derek pushed his chair back. That makes no sense, he said. Dad's lived there for 20 years. Victor finally spoke, his voice tighter now. Samuel, are you certain these are the finalized filings? Samuel met his gaze without hesitation. These are the official trust records submitted to the court. The room suddenly felt smaller. For 2 decades, my father had ruled that mansion like it was a private kingdom, but on paper, it had never truly been his. Samuel rested one hand on the binder and closed it halfway. And unfortunately, he added calmly, that isn't the only issue. Samuel opened the binder again. By now, the room had grown noticeably quieter. Even Derek, who had challenged every earlier statement, remained silent as Samuel placed a new set of documents in the center of the table. These records, Samuel said, come from First Manhattan Bank. My father frowned. What records? Samuel tapped the top page. A line of credit issued 2 years ago. Victor leaned forward immediately, scanning the document. Samuel continued. The loan amount was $900,000. My father's expression hardened. That has nothing to do with this meeting. Samuel slid another page forward. The collateral listed for the loan was the Manhattan property. For the first time since the meeting began, my father's composure cracked. That's impossible, he said sharply. That house isn't collateral for anything. Samuel didn't argue. He simply rotated the page so everyone could see. The bank appears to believe otherwise. Derek shifted in his chair. What does that have to do with anything he said? Samuel looked at him briefly. The loan proceeds were used to settle several outstanding financial obligations. A short pause. Most of them connected to Derek Hayes. Derek's face flushed. "That's none of your business." My father straightened in his chair. "This is absurd," he said. "I would never risk trust property without authorization." Samuel reached into the binder again. This time he removed a single sheet, a signature page. He placed it on the table and slowly turned it toward us. Victor studied it immediately. The signature at the bottom looked familiar. My name. Except it wasn't mine. Even someone with no legal training could see the difference. Samuel rested a finger beside the signature. This authorization allowed the bank to secure the loan using the trust property. Victor's voice was quieter now. "This signature isn't Eleanor's." Samuel nodded. "No." He looked toward Derek. "The bank's submission records show the documents were delivered in person." Derek shifted uncomfortably. Samuel finished the sentence calmly. "By Derek Hayes." The room went silent again. Samuel closed the binder. "And using a forged authorization to secure a loan against trust property," he said evenly, "is a criminal offense." No one spoke for several seconds after Samuel used the word criminal. The air in the room felt heavier now. My father recovered first. "This is ridiculous," Richard said sharply. "That signature is obviously a mistake. Banks misfile things all the time." Victor didn't respond. He was still studying the page Samuel had placed on the table, and the longer he looked at it, the more cautious his expression became. Samuel turned another page in the binder. "There is one more section of the trust that may now be relevant," he said. My father crossed his arms. "I'm sure there is." Samuel began reading. "The residency clause states that the occupant of the Manhattan property may remain in residence for life, provided the asset is not pledged as collateral, leveraged for debt, or exposed to legal liability that could compromise the trust." Victor's eyes moved quickly across the paragraph. Samuel continued, "If such exposure occurs, the residency right is automatically revoked to protect the beneficiary." The words settled across the table. My father's jaw tightened. "You're twisting the language," he said. "That clause was never meant for something like this." Samuel looked up calmly. "The language is very specific." Derek shifted in his chair. "So what exactly are you saying?" he demanded. Samuel closed the binder halfway. "I'm saying that using the property as collateral for a personal loan, especially under a forged authorization, creates exactly the type of legal exposure this clause was written to prevent." Victor exhaled slowly. For the first time since the meeting began, he didn't attempt to argue. My father looked around the table, waiting for anyone to challenge what had just been said. No one did. Samuel turned slightly so he was facing Richard directly. His voice remained calm. "Professional. Final. Mr. Hayes," he said. "Under the terms of the trust, your residency rights have now been revoked." The room went silent. Then Samuel added one more sentence. "The court has already been notified." And for the first time in 20 years, my father looked like a man who had just realized the house he ruled was never truly his. For a few seconds after Samuel finished speaking, the room remained frozen in a strange, fragile silence. Then my father laughed. It wasn't confident. It was the kind of laugh people use when they're trying to push reality away. "You're overreacting," Richard said, waving a dismissive hand. "This is a technical misunderstanding. Lawyers fix things like this every day." Samuel didn't argue. He simply watched him. My father leaned forward, shifting into the same tone he used with bankers and investors when negotiations became uncomfortable. "Let's be practical," he continued. "If the paperwork wasn't handled properly, we'll correct it. I'm sure Eleanor isn't interested in turning a family matter into a legal circus." Derek seized the moment. "This is unbelievable," he snapped, pointing toward me. "She's doing this on purpose. She's always been jealous of this family." I didn't answer. Across the table, Marianne finally spoke, her voice trembling slightly. "You can't do this to your father," she said, "after everything he's done for you." Samuel opened the binder again. This time he removed a single sheet of paper. He placed it calmly in the center of the table. "This is not Eleanor's decision," he said. Everyone looked at him. The trust was written to protect the property from exactly this type of legal exposure. He paused. "As the appointed trustee, I am required to enforce its terms." My father's expression darkened. "What enforcement?" Samuel slid the paper across the table. Victor leaned forward and read it first. My father's eyes followed a moment later. "An eviction notice," Derek said, stunned. Samuel shook his head slightly. "A court-approved enforcement order." Derek stared at him. "You're throwing our father out of his own house." Samuel's reply was quiet. "No." He glanced briefly toward me. "I'm enforcing the trust." My father stood abruptly. "This conversation is over." Samuel didn't move. "In Manhattan," he said calmly, "court enforcement typically requires law enforcement presence." For a moment, no one spoke, and then, from somewhere outside the building, the distant sound of police sirens slowly began to rise. By the time the officers arrived at the mansion that evening, the situation had already moved beyond argument. Samuel had forwarded the trust filings and the court's enforcement order hours earlier. By the time the patrol car rolled through the front gate, the officers already understood what they were walking into. Legal dispute? Property enforcement? Not a family discussion. My father stood in the marble foyer of the house he had ruled for 20 years, still treating the moment like a negotiation. "This is a misunderstanding," he told the officers. "I live here." One of the officers nodded respectfully. "Yes, sir. That's reflected in the documents." Derek, however, wasn't interested in calm explanations. "This is insane," he snapped, pacing across the marble floor. "She can't just walk in and throw our father out of his own house." Samuel stood near the doorway, the leather folder resting calmly under his arm. "The property is held in trust," he said evenly. "Mr. Hayes's residency rights were conditional." Derek shook his head. "That still doesn't make her the owner." Samuel looked at him. "It does." He gestured calmly toward me. "She is the legal beneficiary of the trust." The words settled into the foyer with a strange sense of finality. For the next few hours, things unfolded the way legal processes usually do. Quietly, methodically. Officers supervised while personal belongings were gathered. Access codes were updated. The house staff received new instructions regarding property authority. No shouting, no dramatic confrontation. Just the slow, quiet collapse of a kind of power my father had assumed would last forever. By the time evening settled over the city, he stood outside on the front steps. For the first time in my life, that address no longer belonged to him. He looked at me across the driveway. There was no anger left in his face now, only confusion. Was this revenge? He asked quietly. I never moved into the mansion. People often assume that when a legal battle ends, the winner naturally takes possession of the prize. But houses carry memories, and some of those memories are not the kind anyone wants to live inside. For several weeks after the eviction, the property remained quiet. The staff maintained the gardens. Lights turned on each evening. The house continued functioning the way it always had, but it no longer felt like a home. It felt like a decision waiting to be made. I spent days walking through the rooms, the marble foyer where guests used to gather, the study where my grandfather had planned the early years of the family business, and the dining room, the same room where my father had struck me during that meeting. That room was the first place I changed. The long, polished table disappeared. In its place came several smaller tables. Comfortable chairs replaced the heavy formal ones. The walls, once covered in portraits celebrating family success, were replaced with artwork chosen by the women who now use the space, because the mansion is no longer a private residence. Today, it operates as Haven House. A foundation that helps women who have experienced financial control, coercion, or abuse within their own families. Legal advisors volunteer there. Financial counselors help rebuild independence. Sometimes the work is simple: listening, helping someone realize they still have choices. My grandfather used to say something when I was younger. Property, he told me once, isn't meant to prove who has power. He paused. It's meant to protect people who don't. Standing in that house now, I finally understood what he meant. The mansion isn't a symbol anymore. It's a tool, a place where power no longer belongs to the loudest voice in the room. Sometimes people inherit houses. I inherited something better: the freedom to decide what that house would mean.